Some humiliations don't leave bruises, they carve themselves into memory. Harrison Ford had walked into plenty of rooms where he didn't belong, but one rainy Monday in New York, he stepped into an elevator that would test more than his patience. 6 strangers decided he wasn't worth a second glance until they made the mistake of shoving him out. 3 days later, they'd learn exactly who he was and why they would never forget it. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story strikes a chord, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. The rain came down in a fine, cold mist, the kind that clung to glass and steel like a quiet warning. Carson Global Tower loomed against the gray sky, its mirrored surface cutting into the clouds, a monument to money, influence, and the kind of power that didn't bother introducing itself. Inside, the marble floor gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting. Expensive shoes clicked in sharp, hurried rhythm. Briefcases swung, phones buzzed. Conversations were clipped, calculated, and already halfway to the next deal. No one slowed down. In the middle of that rushing current stood a man who didn't match the frame. Harrison Ford, 82, his hair damp under the drizzle, wore a waxed canvas jacket weathered into soft creases. Faded jeans that had seen more miles than the elevators here, boots worn smooth at the heel. A leather backpack, scuffed but intact, hung from one shoulder. He carried it the way some people carried history without apology. The security guard at the front desk glanced at him, eyes moving over the jacket, the jeans, the years carved into his face. A flicker of something unreadable crossed the guard's expression before he turned away, pretending to adjust his earpiece. The receptionist didn't look up, her fingers tapping across the keyboard with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to see certain people. Harrison didn't break stride. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus polish and money. Above, digital tickers scrolled market data, each number more important than the last to everyone but him. He reached the bank of elevators, where a small crowd waited. Polished shoes, tailored suits. The scent of cologne that cost more than some people's rent. He stepped quietly into line at the back. No one moved aside. No one greeted him. A few glanced over their shoulders, eyes flicking across his face before returning to the glow of their screens. If anyone wondered what he was doing there, they didn't say it out loud. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they'd already decided. Outside, the rain tapped against the tower's skin in a steady, patient rhythm. The voice in your head leans closer now. The man they're about to shove out of that elevator once flew a helicopter straight into a storm to lift a stranded climber off a cliff. He once built entire movie sets with his own hands before anyone thought to put his name on a marquee. They don't know that. They don't see it. To them, he's just another old man in the wrong place, taking up space. But something in the set of his shoulders says they are about to be very, very wrong. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, spilling cold white light into the polished marble lobby. Inside, 6 executives stood clustered in their tailored suits, the air around them scented with sharp cologne and the faint tang of coffee. They were mid-conversation, their voices low but confident, the kind of conversation that assumes no one nearby matters. Harrison stepped forward, the scuffed leather of his boots whispering against the floor as he crossed the threshold. For a heartbeat, no one moved, but then eyes turned, scanning him from the rain-speckled shoulders of his waxed jacket down to the faded denim and worn boots. A tall man with slick-back blonde hair arched an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smirk. "This one's for the 40th floor and up," he said, the words smooth with mock courtesy. "Not for carpenters." The word hung there, sharp and deliberate, and for anyone else it might have just been a jab at his clothes. But Harrison knew better. They'd picked it because it was meant to sting, because they thought it reduced him to something less than them. A woman in a crimson lipstick and a fitted blazer glanced at the blonde man and chuckled under her breath. She slid her phone from her bag, flicked to the camera, and angled it toward Harrison without even pretending to hide it. "HR's going to love this one," she whispered, her voice low but meant to be heard. Another man reached forward without warning. Fingers flicking at the leather badge clipped to Harrison's backpack. The clasp snapped, and the badge clattered onto the brushed steel floor. The sound was small but sharp, like a pin dropping in a silent room. Harrison bent down slowly, his movements unhurried, his expression unreadable. "Noted," he said quietly, the single word carrying no heat, no strain, yet somehow cutting through the air more cleanly than if he'd shouted. He straightened, slipping the badge back onto his pack. But the moment of stillness was broken by a sudden nudge, blunt toes of an expensive loafer pressed into his shoulder, just enough to make him step back. Laughter bubbled up in the close air, bouncing off the mirrored walls. "Careful there, old man," the blonde said, grinning as if they'd all been let in on the same joke. Before the smile could fade, a third man at the back lifted a folded umbrella and jabbed it into Harrison's ribs, not hard enough to bruise, but with a precision that made it clear it wasn't an accident. Harrison's stance shifted half a step, his hand brushing the steel wall for balance. Around him, the laughter swelled, a sound that wasn't loud but felt like it filled every inch of the elevator. It was the kind of laughter people used when they were certain they had nothing to lose. No one else spoke to stop it. No one else even looked uncomfortable. The woman with the phone was still recording, her reflection caught twice, once in the mirrored paneling and again in the cold lens of her device. Harrison's eyes lifted for the first time, meeting hers in the reflection. Calm, unflinching. It wasn't defiance, not exactly. More like the quiet gaze of someone who had already weighed the moment and found it unworthy of more than a glance. The blond man's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, though he covered it quickly by looking away and muttering something under his breath to the man beside him. The elevator's smooth voice announced the closing of the doors, and the thin line of light from the lobby began to narrow. Harrison took one step back, out into the marble expanse. The laughter stayed inside, trapped with the suits and their smirks, until the doors met with a soft, metallic sigh, and then it was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. Harrison stood there, the badge still clipped to his pack, the scent of cologne fading into the citrus of the lobby polish. The security guard at the desk glanced up, hesitated, and then looked back down at his radio. The receptionist kept typing. Outside, the rain was steady against the glass, each drop a patient tap on the skin of the tower. Harrison's shoulders were square, his breathing slow. His gaze lingered on the closed elevator doors for a long moment, and then his right hand curled slightly, the leather strap of his backpack creaking under the grip. His voice, when it came, was low enough that it barely seemed meant for the air. Noted. Then he turned toward the emergency stairwell, his steps measured, deliberate, carrying him away from the gleam of the lobby and into the shadows behind it. The stairwell was narrow and dim, the kind of space most people only saw during fire drills. The hum of the building's heartbeats, pumps, vents, the low whine of fluorescent ballasts echoed in the concrete chamber. Harrison's footsteps were unhurried, the soles of his boots making a steady rhythm against the metal treads. On the 15th floor, he pushed open a gray door that led into a different world, one without marble floors or panoramic views. Here, the air smelled faintly of coffee left too long on a burner and the wax of freshly mopped linoleum. The walls were plain drywall, the lighting flat and buzzing. It was the engine room of the tower, the administrative and technical floors that kept the upper stories running but were never invited to rooftop galas. A janitor pushing a supply cart rounded the corner. He was young, his eyes tired, his hands red from cleaning chemicals. When he saw Harrison, his expression flickered with mild confusion. Harrison nodded to him. "Morning," he said, his voice low but steady. The young man hesitated, then nodded back with a small smile, as if unsure whether he'd imagined the moment. Harrison kept walking, turning down a narrow hallway marked staff only. At the end was a plain steel door with no window and a keypad lock. He keyed in a code without looking, and the lock clicked open. Inside, the room was silent, except for the faint hiss of ventilation. One wall was covered in monitors, each displaying a different view of the building. The lobby, the executive floors, the parking garage, the rooftop helipad. Tiny timestamps flickered in the corners. Harrison moved closer, the pale glow from the screens reflecting in his eyes. On one monitor, the same group from the elevator lounged near an espresso machine on the 41st floor, replaying the video of the morning's incident for a laughing colleague. On another, the receptionist sat behind the marble desk, head bent toward her phone, while a delivery driver waited at the counter, unnoticed. In another feed, a senior manager brushed past the security guard in the lobby without acknowledgement, the guard's greeting dying in his throat. Harrison watched it all without blinking, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. The building was gleaming glass on the outside, but here in the quiet circuitry of its veins, it showed its true skin, habits of disregard, layers of quiet disrespect that no investor report could chart. The door opened behind him with a soft click. A man in his mid-50s stepped inside, wearing a well-cut suit and the faint look of someone who'd seen too many board meetings to be surprised by much. Howard Lynn closed the door behind him, carrying a thick folder under one arm. He stopped a few feet away, watching the monitors for a moment before speaking. "Rough morning." Harrison didn't turn his head. "Depends who you ask." Howard stepped forward, placing the folder on the desk beside him. "It's done," he said. The deal closed at 9 a.m. You now own 68% of Carson Global. For a beat, neither of them spoke. The steady sweep of a lobby camera played across Harrison's face. He finally looked over at Howard, and there was no surprise in his eyes, just a quiet readiness. Then let's see what we're really dealing with. Howard's gaze followed Harrison's back to the monitors. The blond man from the elevator was still laughing, holding the phone high so another could see. The receptionist hadn't moved. Somewhere on the parking level, a technician lifted a heavy box while two executives walked past without offering a hand. Harrison's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. This wasn't just about a shove in an elevator. The rot ran deeper, and now he could see it from the inside out. He reached for the folder, the paper edges rasping under his fingers. The weight of it wasn't much, but what it represented could change everything in this tower. And Harrison Ford had no intention of wasting the view from here. The office was quiet enough to hear the rain ticking against the glass, each drop carried sideways by the wind before it broke on the pane. The city below glowed in blurred streaks of red and gold, headlights dragging through the mist. Harrison sat at the far end of the long conference table, a folder open in front of him, though he hadn't turned a page in several minutes. The room smelled faintly of old wood and the faint metallic bite of the storm outside. Howard stood in the doorway, holding a notepad, waiting. Harrison didn't look up when he spoke. Invite every mid-level manager and executive leader to the boardroom Friday morning. Howard stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. Do I tell them who they're meeting? Harrison's eyes lifted, catching the reflection of the storm in the window. Don't tell them, he said. Let's see if they walk in smiling. Howard gave the faintest nod, the kind that says he knew better than to press for an explanation. He jotted a note and turned toward the door, but Harrison's voice stopped him. Everyone, Howard, every department head, no exceptions. Howard left with the soundless efficiency of someone who had learned the value of quiet in the presence of certain people. The rain deepened, a steady rush against the glass, and Harrison leaned back in his chair. 2 days. The thought wasn't hurried, but precise. The way a pilot measures fuel against distance. Outside this room, the building still spun on its routines, numbers climbing on screens, conversations about bonuses and mergers, but the ripples had started. By noon, whispers had threaded through departments like smoke. A sudden all-hands on the 44th floor was rare. That it included managers who never shared the same air was even stranger. In the marketing lounge, someone speculated about a new investor. In finance, they guessed a shake-up. On the 40th floor, the blond man from the elevator laughed it off, saying it was probably some overseas billionaire with too much time and a need for applause. Down in operations, a senior council member narrowed his eyes over a cup of coffee, telling a colleague, something about this doesn't feel right. The suspicion hung there, unspoken but alive, while Harrison remained in the empty office, a dark silhouette against the soft glow of the skyline. His gaze traced the sweep of the city like he was memorizing it, storing the moment before everything shifted. He didn't think about the elevator. Not directly, he thought about patterns, about the way arrogance calcifies when no one challenges it, about how a building can look flawless from the street while rotting quietly from within. In 48 hours, they would all be in the same room, and for the first time, they would see the man they thought didn't belong in their elevator. Harrison closed the folder, the soft click of the latch sharp in the stillness, and rose from the chair. The rain followed him to the door. Friday morning broke with a pale winter light spilling over Carson Global Tower, the kind of light that made the glass gleam like it had nothing to hide. On the 44th floor, the boardroom was set with precision. The long walnut table had been polished until it caught the reflection of the recessed lighting overhead. 12 high-backed chairs stood evenly spaced, crystal carafes of mineral water catching the morning sun. At the head of the table, a small brass plaque sat centered. No name, just 2 letters engraved deep into the metal, H. Chef. Outside the glass doors, managers and department heads gathered in loose knots, murmuring theories. Most had never been summoned to this floor at the same time. They shifted their weight, checked their watches, speculated about mergers or budget cuts. In the elevator lobby, the 6 executives from Monday arrived together, still trading smirks. The blonde one leaned toward another and said, "If this is about bonuses, I'm walking." The woman in red lipstick replied with a laugh, "Relax, it's probably just another fossil in a suit who thinks synergy is a personality." Their words followed them into the boardroom as they chose seats, some near the head of the table, as if proximity meant influence. The room quieted when the glass doors opened again, but instead of the expected parade of new investors, only one man entered. Harrison Ford stepped inside. Black of his tailored suit cutting sharply against the pale walls. His shirt was open at the collar, no tie, his hair brushed back but not fussed over. He carried no briefcase, no stack of notes. His eyes moved slowly around the table, landing on each face long enough to be felt. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he stopped behind the head chair, rested his hands on the back, and with a slight turn of his wrist, lifted a slim remote. The room dimmed almost imperceptibly, the wall screen flickering to life. Without preamble, the footage rolled. The lobby camera from Monday, Harrison stepping into the elevator in his wax jacket. The first comment, "This one's for the 40th floor and up, not for carpenters." A ripple of laughter in the recording, mirrored by shifting in chairs now, the flick of fingers knocking his badge loose. The soft, noted caught clearly on the elevator mic, the casual kick to his shoulder, the jab of the umbrella, the doors closing, leaving him in the lobby. The video froze there. Harrison's head bowed slightly as he adjusted the strap on his backpack, the fluorescent light turning the steel walls into mirrors. Harrison's voice broke the silence, low but carrying. "I didn't hide who I was. I just waited to see who you were." No one spoke. The blond man's jaw moved as if words might come, but none did. Across the table, the woman in red stared at the surface in front of her. Harrison's gaze shifted, pausing on each of them. "Anyone want to explain?" The blonde finally tried. "Sir, I didn't know who you were. It wasn't personal." Harrison raised one hand slightly, stopping him. "Exactly, that's what makes it worse." He set the remote on the table, rounded the corner, and took his seat at the head. The brass plaque with HF caught the light. He reached into the folder in front of him and drew out a single sheet of paper. "Dominic's Financial," he said, scanning the group. 3 premium suites on this floor, 40 employees, 2 private lounges, a custom espresso bar. The blond man sat straighter, his color fading. Harrison continued. "All of it built on arrogance, intimidation, and an illusion of untouchability." He placed the paper flat on the table, a termination order already signed. "You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." A murmur rippled through the room, swelling into a protest from one end. "You can't do that." "Contracts." Harrison's expression didn't shift. "So did I, so does every person you marked, every technician you ignored, every intern you humiliated." He stood again, walking the length of the table slowly, the silence following him like a shadow. "Power doesn't excuse cruelty. Status doesn't excuse contempt. You believed you were immune because no one challenged you." He stopped at the far end, turning to face them. "You were wrong." The woman from HR. Hale spoke barely above a whisper. "This will ruin them." Harrison nodded once, then let it. His eyes found the man who had kicked his shoulder. "Still think I don't belong in that elevator?" The man's mouth opened, then closed again. Harrison didn't wait. "Security is already informed. Your badges will deactivate at noon Monday." He started toward the door, his steps steady. At the threshold, he paused and looked back, his voice level. "This isn't payback. It's maintenance." Then he was gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the projector and the weight of consequences settling into every chair. By Monday morning, the footage had escaped the walls of Carson Global and taken on a life of its own. No one could say for sure how it happened. Some swore it was an intern. Others claimed it came from someone in building security. But the video was everywhere, on morning news shows, in business forums, across every social feed that thrived on a mix of outrage and awe. It played in full. The elevator doors, the smirks, the mocking words, the flicked badge, the kick, jab of an umbrella, and the man in the wax jacket stepping back into the lobby alone. Then came the reveal, Harrison Ford at the head of the boardroom table, the footage frozen on the screen behind him, his voice delivering quiet, surgical judgment. By noon, the hashtags had already begun to trend. #respect everyone climbed the charts, followed closely by #HF leadership. Comment sections filled with stories from people who had been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed because of how they looked or what title they carried or didn't. News anchors called it a masterclass in leadership. Business magazines ran headlines like the Ford method, leading without raising your voice. In one segment, a former Carson Global receptionist appeared on camera. She was in her early 20s, her voice steady, but carrying the edge of someone who had learned to keep her guard up. "I worked there 2 years, she said. Got yelled at for things that weren't my fault. Nobody ever stepped in. Then this happened. First time I've seen someone at that level do something for people like us." Inside Carson Global, the atmosphere was very different for the 6 executives from Monday. Lawyers were called, meetings held behind closed doors. None of it helped. The termination orders were airtight, the leases canceled without loopholes. Their emails went unanswered. Their reputations, once the currency they spent freely, were now a liability. Some tried to spin the story, but the footage left no room for spin. The internet had already decided who they were. In offices across the city, managers were replaying the boardroom clip during staff meetings. Consultants were writing case studies. Leadership trainers were calling it a turning point, proof that the most effective authority didn't come from volume or spectacle, but from an unshakable sense of principle. And in the middle of it all, Harrison didn't give a single interview, no press conference, no social media post. He was seen only in passing, walking the administrative floors, speaking with teams that rarely saw an executive. If anyone asked him about the video, he'd change the subject. The headlines could chase themselves. He had work to do. A week later, Carson Global didn't sound the same. The sharp click of shoes across marble was still there, the low hum of voices, the occasional chime of the elevators, but something in the air had shifted. People slowed down just enough to greet the front desk. Hands reached to hold doors instead of letting them swing shut. In the lobby, a young analyst in a navy suit stood chatting with a janitor about last night's game, both of them laughing like they'd known each other for years. Security guard at the front desk, same man who barely looked up that Monday morning, now made a point to stand when someone approached. The tension that had once sat in the corners of the building had thinned into something lighter. That morning, Harrison Ford walked in through the main revolving doors. No private entrance, no side stairwell. Just him, in a pale gray shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow, the kind of shirt that showed he was here to work, not be photographed. The same waxed canvas jacket was folded over one arm, his backpack slung casually over his shoulder. Heads turned, but not in the sharp, measuring way they had before. People stepped aside without being asked, their greetings soft but genuine. Near the far end of the lobby, a maintenance worker was wrestling with a mop cart, the bucket of water tilting dangerously as it rolled over the seam in the marble. Before the bucket could tip, Harrison crossed the space in a few steady strides. He caught it with both hands, steadying the weight until it settled back onto its wheels. The worker looked up startled. "Sir, I've got it." Harrison shook his head lightly. "Take your time, this is your floor." The man blinked, then smiled, and for a moment the lobby felt smaller, like it belonged to the people who kept it running. Harrison stepped back, nodding once before continuing toward the elevators. As he passed the security desk, the same guard from that first morning rose to his feet. This time, there was no quick glance away. He met Harrison's eyes and gave a firm nod. Harrison returned it without breaking stride, the smallest hint of a smile on his face. In the elevator, a woman with an armful of files stepped in at the last second. She looked at him, a flicker of recognition in her expression, then said, almost apologetically, "Sorry. I didn't mean to." Harrison pressed the door button to give her time to adjust the stack. "It's your building too," he said simply. She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing, and they rode the rest of the way in a comfortable silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from hierarchy or judgment. It was the kind that let people breathe. And in a building where power once measured itself in who looked down on whom, that was the real change. The new sign had been mounted just inside the main entrance of Carson Global. Brushed steel letters, clean and simple. Set against a dark walnut panel, "Respect is the dress code." It caught the light when the revolving doors turned, the message impossible to miss. People noticed. They slowed just enough to read it, some smiling, some thoughtful, but all aware it was more than decoration. Mid-morning, a small group of reporters stood near the lobby's edge, waiting for Harrison Ford. He came in as he always did now, no entourage, no announcement, just the quiet presence of someone who belonged anywhere he decided to stand. One reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Ford, now that you own Carson Global, do you plan to change its name?" Harrison paused at the foot of the sign, glancing up at the words before looking back at her. "Buildings don't change people," he said. "People change buildings." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The cameras caught the line. But it wasn't said for them. It was said for the people already moving through the lobby, the receptionist greeting a delivery driver, an analyst holding the elevator for a maintenance crew, the security guard nodding at everyone who passed. The changes weren't flashy, but they were real. And they started with something too many places had forgotten: respect. Harrison spoke later that day in a small meeting with department heads, not from the head of the table, but sitting among them. From the custodial staff to the interns, he said, "You don't know who they are or who they might become. That's not why you treat them well. You do it because it's the right thing to do." The room was quiet, not the tense quiet of people waiting for a reprimand, but the kind that comes when the truth is too clear to argue with. The reporters had gone by then. The headline they'd write would never capture the whole story. Because the real shift wasn't a single moment in a boardroom or a viral video. It was in the dozens of small choices people made every day to see each other. That afternoon, Harrison stood by the lobby doors as employees headed out for lunch. He greeted some by name, nodded to others, held the door for a woman balancing a box and a coffee. She thanked him without realizing who he was until she'd already stepped outside. He watched her go, then turned back toward the sign. Before walking away, he spoke almost like a challenge, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. This week, see how many people you greet that you usually walk past. It wasn't a rule. It wasn't policy. But in a building that had once measured worth in status and image, it was a reminder of something far more valuable. And maybe, for the first time, it was a reminder that would last. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.